Focus a little bit more on that land acquisition ordinance and the implications for industry. NITIN GADKARI, the minister, had refuted the opposition's charges that this government is attempting to dilute the several rehabilitation and resettlement measures in the Land Acquisition Act. Joining us to discuss the pros and cons of the ordinance, the bill for which is now pending in Parliament, which is that the ordinance needs parliamentary approval, we have with us Chandra Bhushan of the Centre for Science and Environment and R.V. Kanoria of Kanoria Chemicals. Mr. Kanoria, industry has been fairly vocal over the last several years that buying land in this country to set up a manufacturing facility is very, very difficult. I'm assuming, therefore, you're in favor of the several measures that this ordinance short circuits. For instance, the consent mechanism or the social impact assessment mechanism in order to make the acquisition of land easier.
I don't want you to put words in my mouth. Personally, I think that the Land Acquisition Act itself was not thought through. It was more of an emotional and political decision. And if you honestly ask me, I think the amendment to the Land Acquisition Act in the form of an ordinance has also not been fully thought through. The fact that land is difficult to acquire in the country is a given. At the same time, we are dealing with a very emotive issue where we are talking about displacement of farmers, displacement of livelihood. So I think it needs to be handled in a very different way. I think that we've kind of put ourselves in a bind by introducing the act in the first place and then trying to amend it because the act as it stands is incapable of actually being implemented in the true spirit that it is meant to be. So let me explain that. I think it's important to understand that this government has tried to, through the ordinance, change the procedure. It has not changed the compensation. So what the government is saying is that let's not make this a lengthy procedure. Let us not have a social impact assessment study. Let us not go through a method of consent, which actually is a very impractical method because it requires several meetings of several gram panchayats to be held. And the process itself is so cumbersome that a poor farmer who wants to actually sell his land will virtually not be able to sell it. And the one who wants to acquire it will not be able to acquire it. So both the needs of the farmer, the needs of the development process and the needs of the buyer all are being compromised through the Acquisition Act as well as through the amendment in the ordinance. So what we really need to understand is that are we willing to sacrifice our development? Are we wanting to condemn our farmers to remain just farmers and not give them opportunity? Let's not forget that 65% of our population is still dependent on agriculture income, whereas only 19% of our GDP is agriculture. If you look at it in developed countries, in a country like the US, only 1% of the population is dependent on agriculture. So we should give our farmers this opportunity, and I think what we need to realize is to find a fair and clear method by which acquisition of land can actually happen. And one of the suggestions we've been making from industry is where there is a willing buyer and a willing seller, why do we want to complicate it with rehabilitation and resettlement and all these kind of things? Because the price discovery happens by the virtue of the transaction itself, where you approach someone to sell the land and you negotiate a price and buy the land. So it's a willing buyer, willing seller situation. And even in that case, the Land Acquisition Act actually imposes the R&R settlement. So this is one aspect of it. The second aspect is that why can't the government designate certified areas? Let us say it says that this 10,000 hectares, if it is purchased by industry, there will be automatic change of land use. Now by not giving that land use change, they are actually denying the farmer the right compensation, because industry, when it buys the land, has to factor in the risk of whether the land use will be changed or not changed, as to what the FIR will be, what will be the regulations associated with the use of the land. So I think there are some very fundamental issues we are discussing today, And I think we've put ourselves in a bind. The way I look at it is that 2 or 3 years down the road, there will be no land acquisition, and actually the farmers themselves will come and say that we need to revisit this act to ensure that at least those who want to move away from farming are allowed to do so. So,
Mr. Kanoria, if you will permit me to interrupt you here, I think we need to distinguish this discussion, along with Chandra Bhushan's comments, between what is eminent domain, where the government acquires land, and I use the word forcibly, in context, for large national projects, for instance, dams, etc. And there, what the resettlement and rehabilitation provisions should be, as opposed to what should apply to the private purchase of land, which is an industrialist or a business, going to, let's say, a group of farmers and negotiating with them, whereby if the farmers are agreeable, then there should be no rehabilitation and resettlement measures. I think that distinction needs to be made in this conversation. In eminent domain, the worry here is that the concept of eminent domain has been expanded to include a variety of things. For instance, affordable housing. Now, building a dam in the interest of the nation and building affordable housing where there is private profit maybe even in play or at play, those are two different things. I think that's where some of this opposition to this bill comes up, and that's what I'm trying to distinguish in this conversation as well. If you'll permit me, I'll just get Chandra Bhushan's comments on this. Mr. Bhushan, what do you make of what or how this ordinance is attempting to change our land laws?
I think I will agree with certain point that Mr. Kanoria said. I think he rightly said that we enacted this law by not looking at many other things. And this ordinance we are trying to push through also in a hurry. I think we need to sit down, think through, and come out with a middle path which will ensure that some of the major problems that were there in the past is not repeated again. We are in 21st century.
So could you be specific about those, sir?
Sorry?
Could you be specific about which elements of the ordinance you don't agree with?
Let me start by saying that the ordinance tries to remove two things. One is the consent mechanism, and the second is social impact assessment. We also believe that the social impact assessment was not a problem. In fact, if you look at Chapter 2 of Social Impact Assessment, the first part is investigation to determine social impact assessment and public purpose. I think this is a very important component. When you are going to acquire land, the point you are making about eminent domain, public purpose, and determination is very important. Investigating what will be the impact. The Chapter 2B, where the procedure is there, where you have to do social impact assessment, you have to go through this, you are going to take 8 months to do it.
That's a painful one.
That I think is also premature. Okay?
Because we don't have the institutions to do it right now.
Yes, we don't have institution to do it. Therefore, it was a premature thing to say that we will have social impact assessment. And it all happened, and we see what is happening in environmental impact assessment. The same thing that Ministry of Environment is doing.
What about the consent clause, sir? I understand maybe the consent thresholds are very high, 80%, 70%. But after all, we ask shareholders to vote on what their companies and managements are doing. So why should landowners not have a say when their land is being taken away from them?
That's where I disagree with Mr. Kanoria. Two things Mr. Kanoria said, that it is between buyer and seller and price discovery. A large part of India is not Delhi, Haryana, and Ghaziabad and Faridabad. A large part of India has no mechanism of price discovery. Whether you go to Chhattisgarh, you go to Jharkhand, part of Orissa, part of even Gujarat. Okay, there is nothing called as price discovery there. Okay, it is price discovery is applicable where you have demand for land. Industries go for mining, there is no demand for land. In fact, in large part of India, there is no title for land. People have customary rights. How do you deal with those issues? Okay, so one is that this price discovery part where a buyer and a seller can deal with each other is applicable only in certain part of India, not in large part of India. And you need a mechanism for land acquisition, rehabilitation, and resettlement there. It is not a matter with a farmer in Haryana, but it is eminently important for a farmer or a tribal in Chhattisgarh. I think that distinction has to be understood.
Taken, sir.
Okay. Point number 2, which is about consent clause. I think some sort of, if not 70% or 80% that we are talking about, I think if we can do better investigation of social impact, what impact it is going to have, what will be the public purpose, how the community is going to be affected, if people are involved in this decision-making process, if we can, from consent, if we could come out with a mechanism for consent come consultation or consultation come consent, I think we will have to have some sort of consent,
all right,
some sort of involvement when you are going to acquire land.
Okay, in the interest of time, I'm just going to give Mr. Kanoria the last word on this. I have a feeling that he might agree with some of the points that you have made. Mr. Kanoria, would you say that an 80% or a 70% consent threshold may be too demanding, but doing away with consent altogether, especially in projects that are not necessarily pure eminent domain, not dams? Affordable housing must require the consent of the landowner, especially when there's private profit at play. Would you agree with that, sir?
I agree with Mr. Chandra Bhushan that price discovery is also not a process which is relevant to many parts of the country, and I think we have to find a solution to it. There has to be proper rehabilitation, there has to be proper resettlement wherever there is no price discovery. Therefore, I mean, one size fits all Land Acquisition Act also may not be the right answer to it. It could be. The second point I'd like to make is when you talk about consent, yes, but my point is that if the social impact assessment study can be done in advance and designated areas be earmarked for different types of development, whether it is affordable housing, whether it is industry, whether it is mining, and if that process can be done in advance, then the possibility of price discovery also increases, because the seller knows what he can expect in terms of the return, and the buyer also knows what the land use can be. So the consent mechanism itself, whether it should be a pre-consent or a consent after the social impact assessment study, is also something which should be
so what do you
suggest,
sir? Do you suggest that this government should look at the law?
Prima facie, I think this law needs a complete revisit. It's not something which can be done in bits and pieces. It's an emotional, sentimental issue. It is fundamental to the livelihood of a large part of the population of this country, and we cannot treat it without understanding the implications on every side. At the end of the day, we also want development, but we don't want it at the cost of people. I mean, that's not what industry wants. Industry also wants to ensure that people get their due returns, but at the same time, development in the country shouldn't stop. The opportunity for new jobs, the opportunity to change one's life, I mean, these are all fundamental questions we need to ask ourselves. The Land Acquisition Act is a difficult act to handle, and it's really a tough problem which the government has got.
I think we're all then speaking the same language. Both our guests saying that this ordinance and the underlying law which it seeks to amend both need an absolute revisit. Gentlemen, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much. We are at the end of the time on this show.